Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Bentley. On behalf of the First Fridays Committee and the University Libraries, Archives, and Special Collections, welcome to First Fridays. This season's theme is To Whom It May Concern. We'll explore the correspondence, letters, notes, messages, and other forms of mail that comprise the backbone of the archives. Today's presentation will also be shared later on the University Library's YouTube channel. First Fridays is a monthly series of presentations made possible by a generous gift from Governor Elmer L. Anderson and Mrs. Eleanor Anderson in honor of former library director Dr. Edward B. Stanford. The presentations are based on materials in the University Archives collection. A special thank you today to our interpreters from Middle English who will be providing American Sign Language interpretation for today's presentation. If time allows, we will have a question and answer session at the end. If Zoom audience members have questions for our speaker today, please submit them using the Q&A function and not the chat so that we can keep track of your questions. And in-person audience, please hold your questions to the end. There will also be a tour after the presentations today. Let's pause for a land acknowledgement. So the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the people on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. So today's presentation features stories from the Wangenstein Historical Library of Biology and Medicine. Emily Beck, the Associate Curator, and Caitlin Lennox, the metadata researcher, will be presenting The Salesman's Scalpels, how to succeed in medical sales without even trying. The Wangenstein's Historical Library recently acquired the correspondence archive of an early 20th century traveling salesman for medical instruments and supplies. With letters and documents ranging from 1924 to 1933, this archive reveals stories about medical practices in the years leading up to the Great Depression, the prices of medical supplies, workplace frustrations, automobile obsessions, and even a romance. In the second half of the presentation, the artifact metadata researcher will tell us more about the medical instruments held in the Wangenstein's artifact collection that are featured in this correspondence archive. With that, welcome, Emily.
Hello, thank you so much for welcoming us here. We're really excited to be here to share this amazing archive and some of the artifacts that we've been working on with you. If you haven't visited us before, you should know that we are one of just a few special collections that are not located in Anderson Library where we are today. We're over on the other side of the river in the Phillips Wangenstein building, which is part of the health sciences sort of section of campus. The Wangenstein was founded in the mid-20th century with financial support and direction from Dr. Owen Wangenstein, who was a general surgeon who is famous for developing the Wangenstein suction apparatus, which vastly improved success rates during abdominal surgeries. He was also a passionate educator who once said, "The most effective teacher, more than anyone else, has within his grasp the means to affect eternity." He was passionate about having a rare medical library on campus because he looked to his colleagues at medical schools on the East Coast and wanted Minnesota students to also be able to learn from the past as they pursued their medical education. Today, the Wangenstein has grown to include a collection of more than 73,000 volumes, and even though we're a library and not a museum, over 8,000 artifacts. Our text materials cover the history of health from around 1430 to 1945, and our artifacts are mostly from the 19th and 20th centuries. These days, we are heavily engaged in teaching and research. We teach somewhere around 70 class sessions per year in all kinds of disciplines around the university and for other local institutions of higher education. We usually do about 3 exhibits every year, and we do pop-up exhibits. We regularly have interns and research assistants who we mentor and include in research projects. So the letters we're talking about today are from a correspondence archive of a medical device salesman who worked in the Midwest. We purchased the archive about a year ago, and I'm going to refer to it as the Klingman Collection. The archive is composed of around 375 letters from 1924 to 1933 from throughout Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. The salesman, Jesse Lytton Klingman, was born in Kentucky in 1898. He served in France at the end of World War I, and by 1924, he was employed as a traveling salesman by the J.F. Hartz Company, a medical supplies company based in Detroit. The majority of the letters in the collection are from friends and family, but there are also a number of business letters from employers and clients. So maybe you can already guess why the Wangenstein was interested in this collection. Minnesota is home to a large number of device companies, medical device companies, and medical technology innovation is a huge part of our state's history. You're probably familiar with companies like 3M and Medtronic, which are contemporary leading manufacturers of medical devices. Did you know that there were also important medical device manufacturers and distributors such as Noyes Brother and Cutler and Brown and Davis Incorporated that were headquartered in Minnesota and served the broader upper Midwest, much like the J.F. Hartz Company? We wondered what light this archive could shed on the ways medical technologies moved between companies that sold them and medical providers who used them. We've thought of lots of questions that this archive could address, like what were the economics of medical technologies in this era? How did class factor into where certain technologies were sold and used? What kinds of expertise did salespeople have? And of course, what other kinds of contextual information did we not even know that we should be asking about in the first place? We were fortunate enough to bring on an intern to process the collection during the summer of 2023. Molly Lumakis is an undergraduate in the history and philosophy of science from the University of Chicago. She spent her summer organizing, writing a finding aid for, and generally exploring the Klingman collection. She found lots of interesting information and left us with lots of questions and ideas for how we could use the collection in teaching and research. So here are 3 things that we all found really interesting that Molly found while she was working with the Klingman collection. So first, Jesse Klingman's relationship with his employers was somewhat strained, largely because of his car. In the early letters to Klingman, his employers at the Hartz Company said, "We think you are starting out well, getting orders for the right items, and we hope you can keep it up." In 1924, Klingman purchased a Dodge Brothers coupe. You can see here on the slide is the registration card for his car. It was a definite status symbol and reflection of his income in the 1920s. The Hartz Company, however, was not as charmed by the car as some would have been. They expressed frustration at the extra cost associated with car travel as compared to the much more typical train travel of the average traveling salesman. In one letter, Hartz expressed, "This is one of the reasons why we have not favored the automobile as compared with the train. If you will compute your salary for these 4 days with your hotel and car expense, you will find that it is greatly in excess of what it would have cost you to travel by train. You also would have been on your territory in 1/4 of the time. It seems to me that a salesman who goes out on the road for nearly a week without writing or giving any reason except a telegram asking for a salary check is treating us with indifference, and we ask for an explanation of this first week of your trip." The other things you can see on this slide are just a illustration of the car that he had, and then there is a receipt from a garage for a bunch of different things that his car already needed, only a few months after he purchased it. So second, Klingman mixed business with pleasure. He had a large network of friends that stretched across the Midwest. To our entertainment, the letters revealed how he would often send gifts and treats to nurses and assistants at the hospitals he sold equipment to. So, for example, in March of 1928, a nurse wrote to him, "My dear Mr. Klingman, I want to thank you very kindly for the records. I must compliment you for your selection. I do enjoy jazz once in a while. You know, ha, she says. Molly noticed how the letters jump easily between flirtation and business. A letter from Julie at St. Luke's Hospital in Racine, Wisconsin reads, "My dear little old salesman, thank you oh so much for the candy. Those gumdrops, jelly beans, and all-day suckers were wonderful. The Heidbrink has not arrived yet, but we are not quite ready for it." And so the Heidbrink she refers to was an anesthetic gas machine. Another letter that Molly identified was from Rose at the Oshkosh Clinic requesting gloves and needles. And she also complimented Klingman's style of writing, talked about golf and the weather, and mentioned a love triangle that ended in the loss of a coworker's job. And on these slides are those three letters that I was referring to.
I think he had a good choice.
So, third, the letters point to ways that shifts in medical theory impacted the business of selling medical instruments. Klingman regularly accepted returns from his clients, from hemostatic forceps to syringes. The clients said that they didn't work, but the Hearts Company insisted that the objects had been used and had not been used properly, particularly with regard to sterilization. Although the germ theory had been introduced in the mid 19th century and medicine in America was well adjusted to the idea of sterilizing equipment and washing hands to reduce the risk of infection during medical treatments, the difficulty that Klingman's clients had with their equipment demonstrates how practitioners were still struggling with the practical implications of this new way of working. So I'm being a little vague here because Caitlin is going to pick up this thread a little bit later about the equipment that Klingman discusses and how they can be triangulated in the Wangenstein's collections. So Caitlin, will you take over?
Thank you, Emily. Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Lennox. I'm the artifact metadata researcher here at the Wangenstein, and today I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our medical artifact collection and the work that we've been doing to make it more accessible to students and to the broader community so that it can be used in teaching and research. Since its formation in the 1960s, the Wangenstein has gradually amassed a shockingly large amount of medical artifacts, around 4,000 medical instruments and over 4,000 historic pharmaceutical products. That's over 8,000 artifacts in total. So why, you might ask? Does a rare book library own so many historical artifacts when we are not set up as a museum of medical history? Though the work of history is often done in relation to textual documents, historical research is enriched by looking at both visual resources, such as illustrations and photographs, and material culture, such as historical artifacts. The three-dimensional and often mundane nature of artifacts can give students and scholars fascinating insights into routine historical practices that textual documents only hint at. By studying artifacts and scrutinizing their design, materials, and signs of wear and use, historians can construct a more multidimensional picture of historic practices. Even more than that, historic artifacts make the past seem tangible in a way that can be more difficult to convey through the study of text alone. This is why the Wangenstein has made it a priority to descriptively catalog and promote instruments held in its collection. And here on the slide, you can see one of our student workers working with a model of a brain. And you can see her holding the two halves of the brain. All right, so describing such a large collection of artifacts is no easy task. And in 2022, Emily and the Wangenstein's lead curator, Lois Hendrickson, received a Minnesota Historical and Cultural Heritage Grant from the Minnesota Historical Society, or MNHS. Their goal in applying for these funds was to provide access to historical healthcare artifacts in the Wangenstein's collection by creating catalog records for the instruments portion of the collection, enriching the artifacts' descriptions, and photographing each instrument. Throughout applying for, receiving, and prepping to begin the MNHS grant, Lois and Emily collaborated with Kaylin Knutson Davis, the Wangenstein's rare book cataloger, and their supervisor, Director of Cataloging, Metadata, and Digitization Services, Jason Roy, to create procedural documentation, trial workflows, and advise on best practices for cataloging such a high volume of items. So, who here knows what metadata is? Anybody? Librarians in the audience? Does anybody want to take a stab at it?
Imitation data.
Imitation data? Okay. The way I like to describe it that's super simple is metadata is data about data. So all the small pieces of information, such as an artifact's creator, date of manufacture, place of manufacture, materials, dimensions, and physical description that make up that typical catalog record that you see in the university's library catalog. Kaylin advised the Wangenstein on what metadata standards would work best for the Wangenstein's project, which was an especially tricky task since many metadata and cataloging standards are set up for textual materials like books and not 3D materials like medical artifacts. Kaylin's work creating a Python script that could transform the Wangenstein's metadata spreadsheets into functional catalog records was instrumental in allowing our staff to contribute this cataloging work without the requisite permissions or deep expertise associated with the cataloger role at the libraries. Kaylin's work and expertise continues to be instrumental to this project. I was hired by the Wangenstein to research the collection's artifacts and to create original metadata for the library catalog so that these artifacts can be searchable by library patrons and more accessible by the broader community. Beyond the metadata, the project also includes taking reference photos of each object and making digital 3D models of a small selection of artifacts. We've worked with Teresa Berger, our Digital Library Services librarian, and other staff in the Digital Library Services unit to ensure that photos are standardized and give users essential visual information about the size and shape of the artifacts and the markings on them. Eventually, these photos will be housed in UMedia and will be connected to each object's catalog record. We included digital 3D models as part of this grant because we wanted to explore the ways of making artifacts as usable as possible to our patrons, even those who may not be able to travel to see the collection in person. Although the reference photos are very useful and frankly really beautiful, you can't manipulate them in the same ways that you would a physical object. Our photogrammetry contractor, Dale Utt, is an expert in making digital 3D models of cultural heritage materials. He has trained a number of our staff in this process and is working with one of our student employees, Kaylee, to make models of about 50 objects that broadly represent the kinds of materials in the collection and connect clearly to Minnesota history. And here on the slide, you can see an image of a catalog, sort of a finished catalog record. In the middle, you have a photograph of a prosthetic device. And then on the far right there, you have a digital 3D model of a prosthetic foot. So, research into the past is best done by triangulating many types of resources in order to get multiple perspectives on historic practices. With the Klingman collection, our student researcher, Molly Lamakis, started with the archive itself, identifying the types of artifacts mentioned in Klingman's business correspondence. Whether they were items requested by customers for purchase, quibbles with Klingman's employer, J.F. Hartz, about unorthodox inventory exchanges, or information about new medical technologies recently released on the market that Klingman was tasked with promoting. In my work as an artifact researcher and cataloger at the collection, I often look directly at the artifacts themselves as valuable sources of historic information. However, I also rely on the collection's amazing textual primary sources, especially the genre of texts known as trade catalogs. Trade catalogs were lists of items for sale by manufacturer or distributor and often contained illustrations of the items in question. Much like catalogs we receive by mail today, although more and more of these types of sales are now happening online, 19th and 20th century trade catalogs were often very ephemeral in nature, issued periodically as companies updated their inventory. And here on the slide, we have a few examples of trade catalogs. Up here at the top, we have the American Hospital Supply Corporation that has images of X-Acto syringes, the BD Yale Luer syringe, and more. We have a Becton Dickinson catalog on the far left here that has the sort of typical BD Yale Luer lock syringe. And then in the far right corner here, we have a catalog from Charrière Collin AC, which was a French surgical manufacturer, and it has images of hypodermic syringes. In the middle, we have a letter talking about X-Acto syringes. And then across the right-hand side, we have an all-glass Luer lock syringe. So Trade catalogs can not only help researchers and catalogers such as myself identify artifacts within the Wangenstein's collection, but also help put these artifacts into a broader context of a boom in technological innovation and the increasing importance of regional and even national commerce. Trade catalogs even occasionally provide textual information about the uses and benefits of particular items that can help scholars tease out underlying cultural values and assumptions about medicine and health in specific eras. Other books from the Wangenstein's collection can also provide further context into historic medical practices that involve the instruments in the Wangenstein's artifact collection. So, that being said, we thought it would be fun and interesting to give you a few examples of what this triangulation of artifacts and textual primary and secondary resources actually looks like using the Klingman collection. First up, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Karsten's silver stem pessary. So, a letter from Klingman's employer mentions a sale of a set of 6 Karsten stem pessaries, for which he felt that Klingman undercharged since he only charged the customer $5. I thought we were getting $12 a dozen for these net, chastises Harsh. He appended a more pleasant, personal note to the missive, however. Biz is good. Hope you are well. These days, the history of reproductive health is of great interest to our students and researchers, particularly because there are lots of conversations happening in our contemporary culture around contraception, pregnancy, and childbirth. Given this interest, we frequently have these materials out on these themes. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a time of considerable innovation in the fields of gynecology and obstetrics, and the designs for instruments related to childbirth, gynecological surgery, and uterine health proliferated. J.H. Karsten, who you can see up here on the right, was a physician and faculty member of the Detroit Medical College starting in 1871. Karsten was especially well known in the field of obstetrics and gynecology and served as the president of the American Association of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. Pessaries are small prosthetic devices that are inserted into the vaginal canal and used most frequently to treat pelvic organ prolapse. Stem pessaries are pessaries that are inserted into the cervix and the uterus and are an early form of intrauterine device, or IUD. Karsten published extensively on the benefits of stem pessaries for patients with conditions such as amenorrhea, or lack of menstrual period, dysmenorrhea, excessive pain with menstrual period, and difficulty conceiving. Karsten believed that inserting a stem pessary into a patient's cervix and uterus would cause the organ to attempt to force the device out, inducing muscular contractions that would force the uterus to grow larger and stronger. Karsten based his stem pessary design on that of Thomas Chambers' stem pessary, with one caveat. He commissioned Chambers' design, which was frequently made of vulcanized rubber, to be made out of silver instead. Karsten claimed that rubber was difficult to sterilize, degraded over time, and caused unfortunate vaginal discharge in patients that used rubber pessaries. Today, we know intrauterine devices as a common and effective method of contraception. So it's difficult to say, however, how well known this use of a stem pessary was in 1925, especially since Karsten advocated for their use as a cure for infertility. It's interesting to look back on these early stem pessaries and see how their changes in use and design mirrored society's changing views around the bodies of people with uteruses and reproductive health. All right. The early 20th century saw the rise of medical tools with a single base and interchangeable blades or needles. X-Acto, which you may know as a company that produces cutting tools for like crafting projects, right? Actually was formed in New York in 1917. The company originally produced medical syringes and then expanded also to providing scalpels with interchangeable blades. Becton Dickinson was formed in 1897 and is currently one of the largest global medical technology companies in the world. In 1925, the company patented the Luer-Lok syringe, a glass syringe with a standardized system of fittings for needles and tubing that eliminates potential leakage at the connection point. The Luer syringe itself was in fact an older invention, developed by Parisian instrument maker Hermann Wolfling-Luer in 1894, featuring a conical nozzle. A variation on this design became the standard hypodermic syringe for much of the 20th century due to its ease of use, manufacture, and sterilization, as well as its durability. Becton Dickinson acquired partial rights to Wolfling Luhr's patent for the Luhr syringe in 1898 for $40, which is about $1,439 in today's currency. And this allowed Becton Dickinson to trademark the Luhr syringe's leak-free connection point for needles. Though we may now take the design of hypodermic syringes for granted, this technology was very new when Klingman worked as a medical supplies salesman, and many of his customers did not yet know how best to work with these devices, as evidenced by a letter Klingman received from his employer, J.F. Hartz. On November 29th, 1930, the Hartz Company wrote to Klingman out of frustration and embarrassment. Klingman had put in a request that the company replace a set of X-Acto syringes for the Ashland General Hospital because they had broken, perhaps during sterilization or because the needles had been replaced incorrectly. Hartz was worried about making hogs of themselves by asking too much of the company and asserted, "We don't get complaints from any of our other traveling men. Your complaints are more severe than anybody else's. This may help you with your customers, but it does not help you with your house." Somebody's in trouble. All right, so show of hands for those of you who are comfortable sharing. Who here had their tonsils taken out as a kid? Okay, so like quite a few folks. Okay, so in a letter to Klingman on November 21st, 1930, Hartz was concerned about requests Klingman made to alter several tonsil surgery instruments that J.F. Hartz Company sold. "Have you any idea what this costs us? And do you know that this cannot be done at all, this thing that you ask us to do? How can we put prongs closer together on the Bellinger tonsil forceps, except by making a new one? Same holds true of the Botcher tonsil hook and the Tidings tonsil knife. These knives are damaged, as by wrapping in paper, the edges are blunted. Of course, this can be readily fixed, but we cannot have our staff of instrument makers in our shop doing this sort of thing free of charge." So, once again, we see Klingman playing nice with his customers at the expense of his relationship with his employer. Tonsillectomy and tonsillectomy, full or partial removal of the tonsils, were routine medical procedures in the early to mid-20th century. In fact, between 1915 and 1960, tonsillectomies were the most frequently performed surgical procedure in the United States. They were prescribed mostly for children, as the prevailing focal theory of infection assumed that infections in one area of the body, such as the tonsils, could lead to more systemic disease and infection throughout the entire body. The mouth, nose, and throat in particular were seen as entry points in the body for pathogens, and the tonsils were one of the more potentially diseased areas of the body. Thus, removing the tonsils was seen as a preventative care practice. There is some indication that routine tonsillectomies were also a large source of income for surgeons, and this financial incentive led them to being overprescribed. The mundane nature of surgery promoted the assumption that it was safe and an effective practice, and some parents would even proactively request their children's tonsils be removed. Despite the often routine nature of tonsillectomies, medical practitioners' opinions of the procedure were actually quite mixed. In the mid-20th century, the practice of tonsillectomies became linked to outbreaks of polio among children. Some physicians argued that the removal of the tonsils actually made children more susceptible to the virus. There was also no agreed-upon criteria for evaluating the efficacy of tonsillectomy as a procedure, and tonsillectomies became a great point of contention, both between medical practitioners from different specialties, such as pediatricians and ear, nose, and throat surgeons, but also in journalistic pieces addressed to a general audience. As better and better antibiotics began to be developed, doctors were less convinced that surgery was necessary. The popularity of the procedure began to steeply decline starting in around like the 1970s. On the slide here, you can see a tonsil snare overlapping the letter on the left. Unfortunately, it is missing its sort of characteristic wire loop that comes out of the end, and that's the portion that actually would loop around the patient's tonsils. And then on the right here, starting from sort of the far left and top, we have the tonsil forceps, the tonsil hook, and the tonsil knife. And those images were taken from a 1915 trade catalog. The last artifact mentioned in Klingman's letters that I'd like to discuss are Murphy buttons. A letter from Julie, dated May 14th, 1927, requests that Klingman may also have your company send 2 medium-sized Murphy buttons at $2. These small metal devices are a unique piece of surgical history. And so I'm curious because these are kind of fun. Maybe I have a weird definition of fun since I work with medical artifacts. Does anybody here know what a Murphy button is?
Murphy button.
Nobody. Okay, cool. We're all learning something today. These devices, known more generally as anastomosis buttons, were originally invented by American surgeon John Benjamin Murphy in 1892 as a surgical intervention for cholecystitis, or an inflamed gallbladder caused by blockages of the bile duct by gallstones. The brass buttons, and I think the ones in the slide here are nickel plated because you can see they kind of have a silver color, would be attached to the gallbladder and the duodenum, or the top part of the small intestine, by purse string sutures and then snapped together, creating a free passage between the 2 organs. And these 2 halves of a Murphy button on the left, they're a little rounded. They've got a few holes in them and one large hole in the center. And then you can see the cylindrical portion where they would snap together in the patient's body. Many Murphy buttons were also used to hold together parts of the intestine. Once the area healed, the idea was that the patient's body would naturally pass the small metal devices, though this rarely worked quite so well in practice. Also, by contemporary medical standards, Murphy's testing of his surgical device seems a little bit truncated, maybe kind of hasty. I hope you're all done eating at this point. I'm sorry. This is the weirdest story I will share with you today. I decided to perform cholecystoenterostomy, say that 10 times fast, by my anastomosis button, which I had used 6 days previous. He noted in the 1892 paper that he used to present his invention to the medical community. It also, however, made the process of gallbladder surgery extraordinarily speedy. It takes about as long to describe the operation as to perform it. The time occupied with the First Lady on whom I operated was 11 minutes, from the entering of the peritoneal cavity until the closing of the same. As one might imagine, this invention had mixed results. Though it shortened the process of abdominal surgery, its use also produced surgical complications such as necrosis or tissue death, and the buttons were often rejected by the patient's bodies as foreign objects. However, Murphy's invention did pave the way for successful innovations in intestinal surgery, and thus play an important role in its development. Thank you for listening to me bend your ear for a little bit about a few of the many fascinating artifacts in our collection. Now, Emily will talk to you about how we use our artifacts and other resources in the collection to create an environment of a learning laboratory for students, faculty, and other patrons.
Okay, so this grant project has been a really great opportunity to actually understand the materials that we have in the collection. And the stories Caitlin has been outlining are great examples of the kinds of information we have all learned and will continue to learn. And this has been a really, really excellent opportunity to expand on the kinds of teaching and research opportunities that we can engage students with. So, for example, since 2009, the Wangenstein has been heavily involved in a history of medicine class that explores the history of medical technology in America. The class was first imagined as a small seminar with around 18 students and has grown to have a capacity of about 80 students today. It's offered every fall, and it draws students from all over the university, many of whom are interested in exploring careers in the health sciences. A major component of the class involves engaging directly and closely with medical artifacts. Over the course of the semester, the class comes to the Wangenstein at least 5 times, so we can do active learning on both content and skills that are critical to course goals. For example, students learn about the history of reproductive technologies by looking at contraceptive devices. They learn about developments in testing by examining urine and blood testing kits. And they look at hearing aids and prosthetic limbs to think about how disability is conceptualized in American medicine. The students in this course are also required to complete a major research project on an individual object in the Wangenstein's collections. We think of this as adopting. So they adopt something they think is interesting and they use it as a jumping off point for research on a historical medical topic. This year, we took advantage of Caitlin's expertise and asked her to give a session on artifact research, rather. She spoke directly from her experience researching artifacts and gave students concrete information about places to look for information and questions to ask in order to understand these objects. And so on this slide is Caitlin presenting to this year's students, and then a microscope, which I'm sure we brought out for the students to look at. So I'm looking forward to using the Klingman collection in this class next year so we can show students examples of how to connect artifacts to specific history and historical people and moments in our region. As we've developed our pedagogical abilities around engaging students with artifacts in this one particular class, we've also been able to bring artifacts into conversations with texts in other courses. They have recently been used in studio arts classes to help students think about form, in history courses to spark conversations about the appropriation of images of Native peoples, and in English classes as students consider the scientific context of works like Dracula and Frankenstein. By looking to museum studies and other cultural heritage fields, we're able to develop our abilities to help students interrogate objects as evidence of intellectual, social, and cultural changes in the ways people have understood their bodies. As you may have already understood from what we're saying, the Wangenstein is really invested in student success, and this is why we really focus on teaching a lot. But we also really love mentoring students through internships and directed study opportunities and employment. So Molly, whose work we've talked about here a lot, is one of the great examples of how students do research with us on text materials. At the end of her internship with us, Molly made an online exhibit about the Klingman collection, as well as a poster that we printed and is currently hanging in our annual student success exhibit. So here you can see two pictures of her physical exhibit and then a screenshot of her online exhibit. And there's also a Z link there. And you can visit. I encourage you to visit it and look at what she created because it's really awesome. We've also had a ton of students working with us on the artifact project. So student worker Darby Ronning, who you saw earlier, she was the student looking at the brain model in an image a while ago. She sadly for us has graduated and moved on to bigger and better things. She was indispensable to this project. She helped the Wangenstein through many initial stages of the project, including aiding in inventorying and moving the artifacts from the Wangenstein's old home in Deal Hall to our new place in the Phillips Wangenstein building. She ensured that everything had a barcode and a tag number. She also helped wrangle and reconcile initial artifact data, time trial workflows for photography and cataloging, and so much more. Early in the project, we also had 2 undergraduate interns who made another online exhibit about provenance information about the artifacts. And yet another undergraduate intern did artifact research on a variety of artifacts, including a tooth key, which she completely fell in love with, which was really fun to watch. And we had a high school student who did a pop-up exhibit on tamper-proof artifacts in the collection. We have 2 longtime student employees who've been instrumental in organizing the artifacts, both physically in the stacks and in organizing data about them in the spreadsheets. We had 2 student interns a couple of years ago begin on, again, locating the provenance information. And we've had at least 7 student employees in charge of taking reference photos of the artifacts, one of whom, Kaylee, has become our expert in photogrammetry. And on this slide, you can see there's a link to a couple of things that our students have made, the online exhibit, some posts on the library's blog, and then the poster from the pop-up exhibit. And these are our current students who we wanted to show to you because they're so wonderful and do really amazing things. Kaylee, Gavin, Angelina, Rowan, Nate, Jack, Diana, and then Zach and Shamsa, who we didn't manage to grab photos of. So what's next for this archive? Caitlin's and Molly's work specifically, as well as the work of everyone on the Historical Society Grant Project, is really, really critical to make sure we can do our work and empower the work of students and other researchers. Researching and creating metadata about artifacts is taking our understanding of the objects from the mysterious metal instrument, which is what the catalog records used to say, to specific objects with particular histories. Texts like the archive of our traveling salesman, Jesse Klingman, personalize these objects, giving us details about how they moved through space and held meaning. So what's next? We've already started to take in new artifacts, like this collection of orthopedic implants. Although our focus in the Wangenstein is still squarely on texts, we know that there are aspects of healthcare that we don't have represented in the artifacts that we think students and researchers will be interested in. Thanks to this project, when we were offered this collection, we knew that we didn't have any orthopedic implants, and so it would be a good fit for us. And we also know, for example, that we have 121 mortars and pestles, and we probably don't need any more. I hope at the end of this grant project, we'll be able to use these a lot more in teaching and research, and I really look forward to patrons discovering themselves in the catalog, these items themselves in the catalog. I think we'll have the Klingman collection digitized at some point in the future as well. One of our interns, Diana, is almost done with a really great resource guide that will give researchers a lot of great ideas about how to do that triangulation of artifacts like Caitlin was discussing. And of course, you know that a librarian or a curator or an archivist's work is never done. So after the artifact, the instrument project is done, we'll be moving on to the other half of the artifact collection, the pharmaceuticals. And we would love to see you at the Wangenstein anytime. Please come visit us, look at the artifacts, ask us questions, give us ideas. And thank you so much for sitting here with us. We'd love to answer any questions that you have. We also brought a few things for you to come and look at. We would ask you to please leave your drinks and food back at your chairs, but we welcome you to come up and chat with us about our things. Thank you.
I'm going to bring a mic over.
Thanks, Mike. Caitlin, do you want to come up too?
I have two questions. The first is, since you showed a lot of pictures of hypodermic needles, I'm wondering if you have collections of hypodermic needles since 1982, 1984, and the development of needles that don't puncture the person doing the injection with retractable needles, if that become part of your collection. And second question is, looking at these instruments, when did less corrosive metals start to be seriously introduced into surgical prosthetic devices, hips, things like that?
Those are great questions, which I can only partially answer, partially because syringes is actually an area of our collection we've just started cataloging, right? So I've just begun my research, and actually our intern Jack is doing the bulk of the research on the syringes. I can say that the collection mostly has instruments from the mid-19th century to around the mid-20th century. So not a lot of stuff past 1980. There are a few things, but they're less frequent in the collection. Most of what we have are mid-20th century hypodermic syringes. We also have other types of syringes too, like irrigation syringes. And then in terms of the metals, I know chrome was starting to be introduced as a plating material in around 1920. And I think as the 20th century progressed, you get more and more technology that uses less corrosive material. I remember Jean, who donated that the orthopedic implants that you saw in just a few slides previous, started talking to us about different types of metals that were developed specifically for surgical implants starting around the 1940s, 1950s. So.
Get a bunch. I'll just go down the road here.
Yeah, regarding tonsillectomies, there was the theory, I think still current in 30s and 40s, maybe even early 50s, that about foci of infection. And tonsils were a leading suspect. Of course, they would get inflamed at times and swell up. But I came across a stunning article in the American Psychoanalytic Journal that came out, I think in the 50s, pointing out that it was not really perfectly clear that infection was the main cause for this obsession with taking out tonsils. Of course, bread and butter operation, as you mentioned, was one of them for doctors. But the other was, they pointed out, having done a lot of research, that this was an operation done even as far back as, I think, ancient Egypt, where they would yank these things out with tongs or cauterize them out. There's a strongly psychological element involved in this. And yeah, it's not pretty. In my own case, the traumatic experience of my life was a tonsillectomy operation when I wasn't warned by my parents what was going to happen. And I thought they were trying to kill me when they applied anesthetic ether. This was not good.
Yeah, I mean, the tonsils swell up a lot. They're a lymph area of the body, right? So they're sort of your immune system's first defense when things come into your body, but them swelling up is actually them doing their job. But up until the early to mid 20th century, we really didn't have any idea what they did. And the procedure seemed safe, although there's actually some research to contradict that assumption. And so it was seen just as like, well, you might as well, right? Like, what do they do anyway? They're just there. They just swell up. They're annoying. There is, to your point about there being psychological reasons for it, there actually, I didn't get too far into this, but this idea of the focal theory of infection and systemic disease in the body was not only about physical disease, but was seen also as like being a source of criminality, psychiatric disease in general, just like, you know, the bad elements of society. So getting your kids' tonsils taken out was like a way of preventing them from going down a bad path, right? So you get into a lot of weird 20th century science that we wouldn't necessarily agree with today.
To what extent do practicing doctors and surgeons consult your collection?
Not a ton, but also periodically. Sometimes practicing doctors and surgeons will come in. I think a really interesting example is the head of our anatomy program here has used our, we have a really large collection of anatomical atlases. So really huge texts that show sort of life-size representations or greater than life-size representations of parts of the body. And people are interested in different parts of research in different time periods. And he has found that there are no better representations of cardiac innervation than 18th century anatomical atlases. And so he will has come and looked at the collection sort of as a way to do pre-research when he's collaborating with cardiac device companies. He still needs to do dissections and look at bodies in order to understand things, but to be able to do that pre-research with our collection has been, I think, really helpful for him. We also do a lot of teaching in the med school, particularly around social determinants of health. So we see medical practitioners in lots of different ways in the collection. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. This question is for Caitlin. I wanted to know, were any Murphy buttons ever successfully passed after the gallbladder surgery?
I don't know the answer to that question. Emily, do you have anything? No, unfortunately, I have no idea. They weren't used for more than a few decades. So my guess is that the success of that rate of that was low. Yeah. So, you know, they're an interesting stepping point, but they were definitely not the end point for that. Yeah.
Question here. It's really 3 questions, but it should be quick. Number 1, could we walk into the Wangenstein exhibit, or do you have to make an appointment to get in to look around?
So you are welcome to come over and look at the exhibit anytime. It is just in our hallway. We have a couple of big windows that we put our displays in. So those are up all the time. You are welcome to stop in and see if we're available to chat anytime, but we do ask that you have an appointment if you would like to look at resources. We are also very happy to have a reference consultation, so you can send us an email and we can either meet on Zoom or in person to talk through the kinds of things that you're curious about looking for.
Number two, my father was a large animal veterinarian, and I know there's on the St. Paul campus a veterinary history, but they do not do all this stuff that you're doing. Is there any, like, are they looking into maybe trying this?
They are. They, I think, either recently applied for or recently received, hopefully they recently received one of these legacy grants to really kind of reinvigorate what they are doing over there. They have a new curator who is wonderful and very energetic and doing a lot of work with the vet students. And so I think in the next few years, we're going to see a lot of really cool activity over there.
Good. And my third question is, did poor Jesse ever receive a letter back from the home office that was actually signed by a person and not stamped with hearts?
Yes, he did. Let's see. We can go back here. There's the one with the personal note on it, but Hertz generally would sign his letters. So you can see he actually signed it there. I think you're thinking about the envelopes with the home office stuff. There we go. So that's the personal note here. That was the first time I'd ever seen those like military stamps on the envelopes. I'm assuming it was a common thing, in the 1920s, but yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that's all about. So, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm not sure, Alex, do you have any? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for a great presentation. So like they said, they have some exhibits at the front. Please do not bring up any food or beverage if you want to take a closer look. We also have tours of the caverns with Kate in the back. So if you'd like to go on a tour after this, please connect with her. Otherwise, thank you for attending. And please join us again for our March 1st presentations from the Social Welfare History Archives and the James Ford Bell Library. Thank you.